Picture, if you will, the winter of 872 after Christ. Not just any winter, mind you, but the kind of winter that Viking storytellers would speak of, in hushed tones around their hearth fires for generations to come. This was a winter that killed dreams before it killed people, though it did plenty of both. In the settlement of Sognefjord, carved into the dramatic coastline of western Norway like a wound that refused to heal, young Bjorn Ironhand stood among barrels of rotting meat and counted death. Not metaphorically, literally. He was counting how many people in his settlement were going to die before spring arrived. Now, to understand the magnitude of what we're talking about here, you have to appreciate what food preservation meant to these people. This wasn't like today, where we toss a roast into the freezer and forget about it for 6 months. For Vikings, food preservation was literally the difference between civilization and chaos, between a functioning society and watching your neighbors turn into walking skeletons before your eyes. Bjorn's mother, once renowned as the finest preserver in 3 settlements, and that's saying something in a culture where a woman's skill with salt and smoke could determine whether entire families lived or died, pressed dried herbs to his younger brother's cracked lips. The boy was maybe 14 winters old, though he looked closer to 10 now. His eyes had that sunken quality that speaks of the body consuming itself from the inside out. Here's the thing that would have driven any modern person absolutely mad with frustration. They had started the winter with enough meat. More than enough. The raiding season of 871 had been spectacular. Ships had returned heavy with cattle from Saxon monasteries, with pork from Frankish farms, with whale meat from successful hunts in the northern waters. They had enough protein to feed the entire settlement for 3 years. But preservation, technology, if we can call their methods technology, was failing them catastrophically. By the 3rd month of winter, half their stored meat had turned into a putrid, green-black mass that would kill you faster than starvation. The salt-packed flesh that should have remained edible until spring had instead become a breeding ground for decay that filled their storage houses with the sweet, nauseating smell of death. Imagine the psychological impact of this. You've risked your life crossing dangerous seas, fought armed men, lost friends to Saxon spears and Frankish swords, dragged heavy carcasses back across the water, and then watched helplessly as your winter's survival literally rots away in front of you. It would be like spending months working to fill your bank account, only to watch some mysterious force delete half your money every few weeks. The social fabric of the settlement was unraveling as surely as the meat was decomposing. When Jarl Magnus called the thing assembly, think of it as a combination town hall meeting, and judicial court-hungry warriors spoke openly of abandoning him for Jarl Ericsson's better-supplied halls to the south. In a culture where loyalty to your lord was supposedly sacred, this was the equivalent of a revolution. Women wept as they divided the few remaining portions of dried fish among children whose ribs were becoming visible through their skin. These weren't tears of simple sadness. These were the tears of mothers performing mathematical calculations of death, figuring out which children had the best chance of surviving until spring and allocating food accordingly. The Gothi priest, the spiritual leader of the community, declared that the gods had turned their faces away from the settlement. As evidence, he pointed to the meat that spoiled, even when placed on the sacrificial altar. Not even Odin and Thor would accept their offerings. In a society where divine favor was considered essential for survival, this was essentially a declaration that they were all doomed. Bjorn's mother, this woman who had built her entire identity around her ability to preserve food for her community, died as much from shame as from hunger. Picture that for a moment. You're a master craftsperson, recognized across multiple communities for your expertise, and then your fundamental skill, the thing that defines who you are, fails catastrophically when your community needs it most. Her last words to Bjorn were a whispered command that would change the course of Viking history. Learn the secret that will feed our people through the darkness. Not a request, not a suggestion. A dying mother's final order to her son. Spring arrived like a cruel joke. The ice melted to reveal a settlement that had lost nearly a third of its people. Survivors emerged from their halls looking like ghosts, moving with the careful, deliberate motions of people who had grown accustomed to conserving every ounce of energy. And, That's when Bjorn Ironhand did something that must have seemed either brilliantly courageous or completely insane to everyone watching. At the spring gathering, with 500 assembled Vikings looking on, warriors, women, children, priests, jarls from neighbouring settlements, he made a blood oath that would have made even the most ambitious saga hero think twice. He carved the runes of his promise into the sacred oak tree, the living symbol of their community's connection to the gods. The wood was hard, and each rune required dozens of careful knife strokes, giving everyone plenty of time to absorb the magnitude of what he was promising. He would discover a preservation method that would keep meat wholesome not for one winter, but for two winters. The crowd murmured in disbelief. Keeping meat edible through 2 complete winter cycles was the stuff of legends, the domain of gods, not mortal men. It was like promising to invent a flying machine or turn lead into gold, theoretically possible in the realm of myth, but practically impossible in the real world. But Bjorn had done his calculations, and the mathematics were brutally simple. Every raiding season, their ships returned with enough meat to feed everyone for 3 full years. Yet spoilage consistently claimed 2/3 of their stores. They weren't facing a problem of insufficient supply, they were facing a catastrophic failure of preservation technology. Solve the preservation problem, Bjorn reasoned, and you solve everything. No more starvation winters. No more watching children waste away while barrels of rotting meat mocked your failures. No more warriors abandoning their oaths because their families were dying. No more communities dissolving because they couldn't master the basic technology of keeping food edible. Jarl Magnus, desperate to maintain his authority in the face of growing opposition, granted Bjorn a small trading vessel and 12 men. It was a calculated gamble by the leader who was running out of options. If Bjorn succeeded, Magnus would be credited with sponsoring the quest. If Bjorn failed and died in some foreign land, well, at least Magnus would have demonstrated his willingness to try something, anything, to solve their crisis. As Bjorn's ship pushed away from the familiar fjords of his homeland, heading south toward unknown waters and foreign shores, he carried with him not just the hopes of his starving community, but the weight of a promise that would either make him a hero remembered in saga songs for 1,000 years, or a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition exceeding wisdom. But here's what no one in that crowd of 500 Vikings could have predicted as they watched his sail disappear beyond the horizon. Bjorn wasn't just embarking on a quest to solve a food preservation problem. He was about to unlock the secret that would transform the Viking Age itself, enabling expeditions that would reach from Greenland to Constantinople, fueling an expansion that would reshape the medieval world. The question that should be burning in your mind right now is this: what could a young Viking possibly discover in the markets and kitchens of foreign lands that his own people, with generations of preservation knowledge, had never figured out? What secret was worth a blood oath carved into sacred wood? And how would mastering that secret transform not just his own settlement, but the entire trajectory of Viking expansion across the known world? Bjorn's journey south became something extraordinary, a masterwork of intelligence gathering disguised as ordinary trade. Think of him as a medieval industrial spy. But instead of stealing military secrets or technological blueprints, he was hunting for something far more valuable: the knowledge that could keep his people alive. His first stop was Hedeby, the great trading hub at the base of the Danish peninsula. Imagine the Viking equivalent of New York City, a bustling, polyglot marketplace where amber from the Baltic met silk from Constantinople, where Frankish silver clinked against Arab gold, where a dozen languages mixed in the salty air above wooden docks, crowded with ships from across the known world. In Hedeby's markets, Bjorn traded precious amber, those golden nuggets of fossilized tree resin that were worth their weight in silver, for something much more valuable than coin: access to Frisian merchants who had learned preservation techniques from Roman masters. The Frisians were the master traders of the North Sea, and they guarded their commercial secrets as jealously as kings guarded their treasures. Each port Bjorn visited revealed tantalizing fragments of knowledge, like pieces of a vast puzzle scattered across the medieval world. In London, Saxon monks showed him fish dried with sea salt that had been blessed under the full moon, not because they believed in lunar magic, but because the monks had observed that salt, harvested during certain tidal conditions, produced better preservation results. In Rouen, Frankish butchers demonstrated how they layered pork with coarse salt from the Camargue, that mysterious delta region in southern France, where the Mediterranean met the Rhône River. These craftsmen had inherited techniques from Roman garum makers, the people who had perfected fermented fish sauce that could last for years without spoiling. But here's the frustrating reality that Bjorn discovered at every stop. These methods barely lasted one winter, certainly not the 2 winters he had sworn to achieve. He documented each failure point with the methodical dedication of a skald memorizing a saga, noting exactly where and why each technique fell short of his ambitious goal. The real breakthrough began when Bjorn reached Córdoba, the glittering jewel of Al-Andalus in southern Spain. Picture this city in 873 after Christ, white marble buildings reflecting the Spanish sun, the Christ morning call to prayer echoing across courtyards filled with orange trees, and, most importantly for Bjorn's purposes, the intoxicating scent of preserved meats that had travelled all the way from Damascus, without showing the slightest sign of spoilage. This was where Bjorn encountered a level of preservation technology that made everything he had seen in northern Europe look primitive by comparison. The Arabs and Moors of Iberia had inherited and refined techniques that stretched back through Byzantine Constantinople to ancient Persia, creating a preservation tradition that spanned continents and cultures. Bjorn apprenticed himself to Yusuf al-Dimashqi, a spice merchant who controlled the southern trading routes like a medieval logistics emperor. For 6 months, Bjorn hauled 100-pound sacks of salt and exotic spices, guarded caravans through mountain passes where bandits waited in rocky ambushes, and earned the slow, careful trust of men who dealt in secrets worth more than gold. During those 6 months, Bjorn observed every detail with the intensity of a man whose life and the lives of everyone he had ever known depended on what he learned. The Arabs, he discovered, understood preservation as a sophisticated art form that combined 4 essential elements, each as crucial as the others. First, the quality of salt mattered far less than the method of its application. The Vikings had been obsessing over finding the purest, whitest salt, when what actually mattered was understanding the rhythm and timing of salt application, when to apply it, how much to use, and crucially, when to remove excess salt that could oversaturate the meat. Second, smoke had to come from specific woods burned at precise temperatures, not just any smoke, and certainly not the thick, choking clouds that Vikings typically used. The Arabs had identified particular trees, alder, juniper, certain fruit woods that produced smoke with preservative compounds that actually penetrated the meat rather than just coating its surface. Third, the meat required exact moisture content before treatment began. Too wet, and the preservation process would fail from the very start. Too dry, and the salt and smoke could not penetrate properly. The Arabs had developed techniques for measuring this moisture content that seemed almost mystical to northern eyes. Fourth, and most crucially, the entire process demanded patience, measured in days and weeks, not the hours that Viking preservers typically invested. This was perhaps the hardest lesson for a culture that valued quick, decisive action. True preservation was a slow art that could not be rushed. But even with all this knowledge, Bjorn was still missing the final, crucial component. He had learned sophisticated techniques, but he still lacked the secret that would push preservation from 1 winter to the impossible goal of 2 winters. That final revelation came through the most unexpected source imaginable. In a smoky, waterfront tavern in Cadiz, where the Atlantic Ocean met the Mediterranean and ships from 3 continents unloaded their cargoes, Bjorn met Hakim the Moor, a grizzled former ship's cook who had sailed with Byzantine merchants into the frozen seas of the far north. Picture this encounter: 2 men from completely different worlds, sharing wine and stories in a language that was mixture of Arabic, Latin, and maritime traders' cant. For 3 days, they negotiated carefully, each man sensing that the other possessed something valuable, neither wanting to reveal too much too quickly. Finally, after Bjorn had traded his silver arm ring, a piece of jewelry that represented months of raiding profits, and sworn a sacred oath of friendship that bound him by the most solemn Viking traditions, Hakim revealed the missing component. The technique had not originated with Romans or Arabs at all. It came from whale hunters in the White Sea, those hardy souls who pursued the great leviathans in the Arctic waters north of Russia. These hunters had developed a preservation method that could keep blubber and whale meat edible through year-long voyages in conditions that would destroy any other preserved food. The secret was cold smoking at precise temperatures, alternating with salt applications over exactly 14 days, followed by storage in specially prepared barrels lined with rendered seal fat and juniper. The process required maintaining temperatures cool enough that you could hold your hand in the smoke without pain, cycling between smoking and salting in a rhythm as precise as a ship's bell-marking time. Bjorn understood immediately that he now possessed knowledge worth more than gold, more valuable than the finest Damascus steel or the most perfect Byzantine silk. He had found the secret that could transform not just his own settlement's survival, but the entire scope of Viking expansion across the known world. As his ship turned north toward home, loaded with Portuguese salt, Arabian spices, and most importantly, the confidence of certain success, Bjorn faced the ultimate test that awaited him, convincing his desperate, skeptical people to trust foreign magic that combined Christian, Muslim, and pagan knowledge. The question that should be haunting you now is this: would a community that had nearly starved to death be willing to gamble their precious remaining food stores on techniques learned from foreign masters? And if the preservation failed, if Bjorn's two-winter promise proved to be nothing but ambitious fantasy, what would become of the young man who had sworn a blood oath that he could not fulfill? Bjorn Ironhand returned to Sognefjord as autumn painted the Norwegian mountains in shades of gold and crimson, but he found a settlement that looked more like a graveyard than a community. The great starving winter had not been a one-time catastrophe, it had been a preview of dissolution. Jarl Magnus had lost 40 warriors to rival, Jarls during Bjorn's absence. These weren't battlefield casualties, these were deliberate defections by men who had sworn sacred oaths, but valued their family's survival more than their honor. In a culture where breaking an oath to your lord was considered worse than cowardice in battle, this represented a complete collapse of the social order. The settlement's population had dropped from nearly 800 souls to fewer than 500. Some had died from the lingering effects of starvation. Others had simply packed their belongings and left for communities rumored to have better preservation methods. The Sognefjord that Bjorn remembered from his youth, proud, prosperous, feared by enemies and respected by allies, had withered into a desperate shadow of itself. But Bjorn arrived, carrying more than just knowledge. His ships groaned under the weight of 50 pounds of Portuguese salt, Arabian spices that glittered like jewels in the northern light, and most importantly, the unshakable confidence of a man who had solved an impossible puzzle. The question was whether his people would trust him with their lives. At the emergency Thing assembly, Bjorn made a request that prompted the fiercest debate in the settlement's history. He asked for 2 elk and 1 whale's worth of meat for his preservation demonstration. To put this in perspective, that represented nearly a quarter of their total food stores for the coming winter. It was like asking a bankrupt company to invest their last remaining capital in an unproven technology. Opposition came from the most unexpected quarters. Olaf Salthand, the settlement's master preserver for 20 winters, declared Bjorn's foreign techniques an insult to the ancestors. Here was a man whose entire identity was built on traditional methods, whose reputation had been established through decades of careful practice, watching some young upstart propose to revolutionize everything he had ever known. The Gothi priest added religious objections, warning that mixing Christian, Muslim, and pagan knowledge would anger all gods equally. In his view, Bjorn was proposing a kind of spiritual contamination that could bring down divine punishment on the entire settlement. Why risk offending Odin and Thor for techniques learned from foreign priests and infidel merchants? But desperation has a way of overruling both tradition and superstition. After hours of heated argument, the Thing voted narrowly to grant Bjorn his request. They were gambling their winter's survival on the promise of a young man who claimed to have learned impossible secrets in foreign lands. Bjorn proceeded with methodical precision that must have seemed almost ritual in its exactitude. He transformed an entire longhouse into his preservation hall, installing carefully designed smoke channels, salt-curing tables, and storage areas that followed specifications he had memorized from masters in 3 different cultures. Women gathered to watch, as he demonstrated the rhythmic process that would determine whether their children lived or died. Meat cut to exact thickness, not the rough chunks that Vikings typically prepared, but precise portions that would allow salt and smoke to penetrate evenly. Moisture drawn out with calculated salt applications that followed a timing sequence as rigid as the phases of the moon. The smoke flowed from alder and juniper fires kept at temperatures cool enough to touch, each stage timed by marks carved into specially prepared candles. Hour by hour, day by day, Bjorn followed the 14-day cycle that Hakim the Moor had revealed to him in that tavern in Cadiz. But the real drama unfolded over the next 18 months, as the settlement divided into 2 distinct camps. On one side were those who continued to eat from traditional preservation stores, prepared according to methods their grandparents had used. On the other side were those who accepted portions of Bjorn's foreign preserved meat, essentially volunteering to be test subjects for an unproven technology. As the first winter deepened, and the familiar rhythm of scarcity began, the differences became undeniable. Traditional barrels showed the familiar, heartbreaking signs of decay, the green discoloration, the sweet stench of putrefaction, the slimy texture that meant death rather than sustenance. Meanwhile, Bjorn's preserved meat remained firm, red, and sweet-smelling. By spring, even Olaf Sulthand admitted privately that Bjorn's methods had succeeded where traditional techniques had failed. But Bjorn faced a new challenge that tested his resolve in ways he had never anticipated. Warriors who had mocked his foreign magic now offered him silver, gold, even weapons for shares of his remaining preserved stores. But Bjorn refused every offer, insisting that the stores must last through the summer raiding season and into a second winter. This was the ultimate test of his blood oath, not just preserving meat through one winter, but proving that it could remain edible for the full 2 winters he had promised. Think about the psychological pressure this created. Bjorn was sitting on food that could feed hungry families immediately, watching people ration their meals and worry about the coming winter, while he insisted on saving his preserved meat for a test that might be completely unnecessary. If traditional preservation succeeded during the second winter, he would look like a fool who had hoarded food while people suffered. Through the autumn of 874, as the second winter approached with all its familiar terrors, Bjorn's preserved whale meat still held firm. The fat-lined barrels sealed with juniper showed no signs of the decay that typically began after 8 or 9 months. Traditional stores were already beginning their predictable decline toward putrefaction. The moment of ultimate vindication came at the midwinter feast, during the darkest days of the year, when the sun barely cleared the horizon and the cold seemed to press against the very walls of their halls. Before the assembled community, everyone who had survived the 2-year ordeal, Bjorn opened the last barrel of his experimental preservation. The meat was perfect. After 2 full years, it retained the color, texture, and taste of fresh-killed whale. Warriors wept openly not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of men who had lived with the constant fear of starvation, and now saw that fear banished forever. Jarl Magnus rose before the assembled community and pronounced the words that would echo through Viking halls for generations. Bjorn Ironhand shall henceforth be known as Bjorn Saltsword, master of time's decay. It was more than a new name, it was recognition that Bjorn had achieved something that bordered on the magical, mastering time itself in the service of his people's survival. But what no one in that hall could have predicted as they celebrated, Bjorn's triumph was how quickly this preservation revolution would spread beyond their small settlement. Word of the master of time's decay was already traveling along the trade routes, carried by merchants and warriors who had witnessed the impossible. Meat that could outlast 2 winters without spoiling. The question burning in your mind should be this: what happens when a breakthrough technology that solves a fundamental survival problem spreads through a culture that is already pushing the boundaries of exploration and expansion? How would mastering the secret of time itself transform the very scope of what Vikings believed possible? The transformation of Viking society began not with conquest or conversion, but with the soft grey smoke rising from a dozen preservation houses along the Norwegian coast. Within 5 years of Bjorn's triumph, his method had spread through the intricate web of kinship and politics, that bound Viking communities together across the northern seas. The Påsande spread happened through strategic marriages and fostering agreements, the ancient mechanisms by which Viking society shared both wealth and knowledge. Bjorn's sisters wed into prominent Icelandic families, carrying the preservation secrets across the Denmark Strait as part of their dowries. Young men from settlements throughout Scandinavia came to apprentice in Bjorn's smoking houses, their fathers offering political alliances in exchange for access to the knowledge that could keep their people alive. By 880 after Christ, no major raiding expedition departed without provisions prepared using Bjorn's method. But this wasn't simply a matter of improved logistics, it represented a fundamental shift in the social order itself. Preservers gained status equal to master shipbuilders and weaponsmiths. Men who could guarantee 2-year food supplies became as valuable as jarls who could lead successful raids. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Previously, Viking expeditions had been limited by the brutal mathematics of spoilage. You could only sail as far as your food would last, minus the time needed for raiding, minus the journey home, minus a safety margin for storms and delays. Most expeditions lasted weeks, not months, and certainly not years. But ships provisioned with 2-year supplies suddenly made previously impossible journeys not just feasible, but almost routine. This was the technological breakthrough that enabled the great age of Viking expansion, not better ships or sharper swords, but the ability to keep warriors fed during voyages that stretched beyond the horizon of the known world. The first major test came with Ingolf Arnarsson's colonization of Iceland in 874. Previous attempts at permanent settlement in Iceland had failed catastrophically because arriving colonists could not establish sustainable food sources before their imported supplies spoiled. Using Bjorn's techniques, Ingolf preserved enough whale, seal, and reindeer to keep 70 settlers alive through Iceland's brutal first winter. But the most dramatic example of how preservation technology transformed Viking expansion came with Eric the Red's banishment to Greenland in 982. Eric wasn't just an explorer, he was an exile, forced to leave Iceland after being convicted of manslaughter. His voyage to Greenland wasn't a planned expedition supported by wealthy sponsors, but a desperate journey by a man who had nowhere else to go. Eric's ships carried 3 full years of preserved supplies, an almost unimaginable quantity by earlier standards. This massive food reserve allowed his settlers not just to survive their first Greenlandic winter, but to spend months exploring their new territory, establishing multiple settlements, and developing the agricultural and hunting techniques that would sustain permanent communities. Most dramatically of all, Leif Eriksson's voyage to Vinland, what we now know as North America, depended entirely on barrels of Bjorn-preserved whale, seal, and reindeer meat that remained perfectly edible after crossing the Atlantic twice. Without this preservation technology, the Norse discovery of America would have been impossible. But success created its own challenges, and Bjorn spent his final decades not refining his preservation techniques, but protecting them from those who would steal or corrupt his methods. Knowledge is power, and power must be guarded carefully if it is to remain valuable. Bjorn established a guild system bound by sacred oaths and protected by severe punishments for anyone who revealed trade secrets to outsiders. Men who broke these oaths faced not just exile, but the kind of ritualized execution that Vikings reserved for oathbreakers and kinslayers, the most despised criminals in their society. Even more cleverly, Bjorn divided the knowledge among his 6 sons, ensuring that no single person outside his family could replicate the full method without cooperation from multiple sources. His eldest son controlled the secrets of smoking woods and temperatures. His second son managed salt trading relationships and knew which varieties worked best for different types of meat. His third son specialized in barrel construction and the fat-lining techniques that created perfect storage environments. This wasn't just about protecting trade secrets, it was about creating a preservation dynasty that would control Viking expansion for generations. The smoking houses became centers of political power, where jarls negotiated not for gold or weapons, but for guaranteed food supplies that could enable expeditions beyond the edge of the known world. Picture the scene at Sognefjord during Bjorn's final years. Ships from across Scandinavia crowding the harbour, their holds being loaded with barrels that contained not just meat, but the possibility of voyages that would reshape the medieval world. Merchants, warriors, and explorers haggled not for silver or silk, but for the preserved provisions that could carry them to Greenland, Vinland, or even the legendary warm lands that some claimed lay beyond the Western Ocean. As an old man of 70 winters, Bjorn stood on the cliffs above Songfjord one final time, teaching his granddaughter Astrid the sacred counting song that timed each stage of the preservation process. Below them, the harbour bristled with masts and sails as ships prepared for voyages that would have been unimaginable when Bjorn first carved his blood oath into the sacred oak. "I gave our people not swords or gold," he told young Astrid as they watched the sunset paint the fjord in shades of fire. "But time itself, time to sail further, settle deeper, and dream larger than our fathers ever imagined possible." 3 days later, Bjorn Saltsword, master of time's decay, died peacefully in his sleep. According to the skalds who sang his funeral song, his funeral ship carried 100 barrels of perfectly preserved meat, enough to feed his spirit crew until they reached the golden halls of Valhalla itself. But Bjorn's true monument wasn't the barrels of meat that accompanied him to the afterlife. His legacy lived in every Viking settlement from Iceland to Greenland, in every ship that carried 2 years of provisions into unknown waters, in every explorer who pushed beyond the boundaries of the known world because they knew their food would not fail them. The blood oath that a desperate young man had carved into a sacred oak during a starving winter had grown into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It had become the foundation of an empire built not on conquest alone, but on the simple, revolutionary idea that time itself could be mastered in service of human ambition. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing about this story. In an age when we think of the Vikings as warriors and raiders, their greatest technological breakthrough was not a better sword or a faster ship, but the knowledge of how to keep meat from spoiling. Sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with violence, but with the quiet mastery of everyday necessities. In the end, Bjorn Ironhand proved that the man who can feed his people through the darkness wields a power greater than any king's crown or warrior's blade. He had indeed learned the secret that would feed his people through the darkness, and in doing so, he had lit a fire that would illuminate new worlds across the Western Ocean.